15 years later, this boy will be found, and what he tells investigators will bring the entire case to a standstill. But back then, on June 13th, 94, no one yet knew how this story would end. That evening, Nicholas Barclay was playing basketball at a court a couple of blocks from home. San Antonio, Texas. The heat near 40 degrees. And in such cities in the summer, there is not much to do but wait for it to get dark. Nicholas was short for his age, 1 meter 42, 36 kilograms, blue eyes, light brown hair, and a noticeable gap between his front teeth. On his left hand, he had a tattoo, the letter T between his thumb and index finger, a J on his shoulder, and L and N on his ankle. For his years, he knew the street better than the school curriculum. He had a diagnosis, attention deficit disorder, and already had 3 run-ins with the police, breaking into a store, stealing sneakers, and threatening a teacher. And so the next day, June 14th, a court hearing awaited him, where they were to decide whether to send him to a secure facility or not. Nicholas did not want to go there, and this is important to understand for everything that happens next. Around 10 in the evening, he called home from a payphone. His older brother picked up the receiver. Nicholas asked to be picked up because it was already getting dark, and he didn't want to walk the 1.5 miles home. His brother replied briefly. Their mother was sleeping after a night shift, so walk home yourself. Nicholas hung up and left the court heading home. He was wearing a white t-shirt, purple pants, and black sneakers, and he had $5 in his pocket. He took no change of clothes or belongings with him, and if he had planned to run away, he surely would have taken something. But he was going home, and it is from this moment that what people would spend 15 years trying to reconstruct begins. Nicholas never made it home, not that night, nor the next day, nor a week later. His mother filed a police report that same evening when she realized her son had not returned. But the police were in no hurry because they knew this address, they knew this family, and they knew this teenager. He had disappeared before, though never for longer than 24 hours. 3 months later, his brother called the police and said he saw Nicholas at night near the garage. He was allegedly trying to climb inside and ran away when he was spotted. A patrol arrived and searched the area, but they found nothing. No trace, no witnesses, no confirmation. Later, the police decided that the brother was likely mistaken or lying, and the case went into the archives. A teenager with tattoos and a court hearing the next day simply vanished after calling home and asking to be picked up. He wasn't picked up. And back then, no one could have imagined that he would reappear only 15 years later, and that what he would tell would not clarify anything, but only confuse everything even more. The police knew this address by heart because calls came from there regularly. Shouting, scandals, sometimes fights. Neighbors called, the patrol arrived, filed a report, and left. For this neighborhood, such things were common, and no one was particularly surprised. Beverly Dollarhide was raising 3 children alone. She worked night shifts at a store, leaving in the evening and returning toward morning. There was barely enough money and even less strength. In 94, she was 44, but she looked significantly older, and heroin had taken its toll. She tried to quit, relapsed, tried again, and so on in a circle. Meanwhile, the children grew up practically on their own. The eldest daughter, Carrie, was already an adult by the time of Nicholas's disappearance. She was married, had a son, and lived separately, although she maintained contact with the family. Of all 3 children, she was the most stable, and she would be the one to later insist on the search. The middle son, Jason, was 11 years older than Nicholas, and he had his own problems. Cocaine, breakdowns, periods when he would disappear for several days and then return as if nothing had happened. His mother asked him to move back into the house, not because she missed him, but because she needed someone to help handle the youngest. Jason agreed. And so there were 2 men in the house, one drug-addicted, the other a teenager who had long since become impossible to control. Nicholas would raise his hand to his mother. He yelled, threatened, slammed doors, and left, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for an entire day, and then returned as if nothing had happened. Beverly called the police several times and then withdrew the reports. It was easier that way, more familiar, and so it went on, time after time. Neighbors later told investigators that it was a normal family for those parts, no worse than others, and maybe even better because they at least stuck together and hadn't drifted apart completely. And so, when Nicholas did not return home on June 13th, no one was particularly worried for the first few days. He had disappeared before, so everyone was sure he would return. The police weren't in a hurry either, because for them, the picture was obvious. A troubled teenager from a problem family disappeared on the eve of his court hearing. A classic runaway. He'd turn up on his own when he got hungry. But he didn't turn up. Beverly filed a report, posted flyers around the neighborhood, and waited for a call. Carey arrived and forced them to search more actively. Jason stayed on the sidelines, either unable to help or unwilling. This was a family where love was expressed not by hugs, but by the fact that they hadn't completely split up yet. They weren't role models, but Nicholas was theirs. Young, difficult, unbearable, and now he was gone, and they were left waiting. The police classified the case as a voluntary departure from home. Not a kidnapping, not a crime, but simply a runaway, troubled teenager on the eve of trial. A standard story for such cases, and therefore no large-scale search was organized. No search parties, no volunteers, no helicopters. They combed the area, questioned friends, checked the bus station, and that was it. They told the mother, "Wait, he'll come back on his own." But Beverly thought otherwise, because she knew her son. Yes, he ran away, but he always returned, at most after a day or 2. That evening, he didn't take any things with him, no clothes, and in his pocket, he had only $5, which wouldn't even rent a room for the night. She was sure someone picked him up in a car, some stranger. Nicholas was afraid of no one and could get in with anyone. She knew that too. But there was no evidence. There were no witnesses. And there were no cameras on that stretch of road. 1.5 miles from the basketball court to the house, and somewhere on that short stretch, he simply disappeared, as if he had dissolved into thin air. The summer of '94 ended. Then autumn passed. Then winter came. The posters with Nicholas's photo on the poles faded. The paper buckled from the rain, and the phone remained silent. After her son's disappearance, Beverly went to rehab and quit heroin, or almost quit. Perhaps for the first time in many years, she had a real reason to hold on, to wait and not give up. Carey continued to live her life with her husband, son, and job, but she did not break contact with her mother. She visited, helped, and every time asked if there was any news. Jason, after that call in September, when he allegedly saw Nicholas at the garage, reported nothing else. The police didn't believe him. His mother also doubted him, and he himself seemed no longer sure of what he saw. He continued to live in the same house, worked when he could, and the cocaine never went away. The case was officially moved to the cold archive with the status of missing person, presumed runaway. No leads, no theories, no suspects. One of thousands of such cases across the country where a teenager left home and didn't return. It happens. A year passed, then a second, then a third. Nicholas was growing up somewhere, if he was alive, and if not, he was never found. 3 years of silence, 3 years of complete emptiness. And then, in October '97, the phone rang in Beverly's house. The call came to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Virginia. On the line was a man who introduced himself as an employee of a shelter for minors in the Spanish city of Linares. He spoke English with a noticeable accent and reported that they had an American teenager. The boy was frightened, hardly spoke, and claimed he had been kidnapped several years ago and taken to Europe. The center requested a description, and the man on the other end of the line dictated. Average height, thin build. He says his name is Nicholas, but he is afraid to give his last name. The operator checked the database, and the description matched several open cases. But when Texas and the approximate year of disappearance, 93 or 94, were added, only one name remained: Nicholas Patrick Barclay from San Antonio, missing since June '94. The center sent photographs and a missing person flyer to Spain. A few hours later, confirmation arrived. The boy identified himself in the photograph and said that, yes, it was him. And this is where the strangest part begins, because the story he told sounded like a movie script. According to him, he was kidnapped while walking home. People in uniform, possibly military, took him out of the country first to Mexico and then across the ocean to Europe. For 3 years, he was kept in basements somewhere in Europe, used for their own purposes and passed from hand to hand. He was not alone there. Others were nearby. He was forced to speak only French, and he was treated extremely cruelly. Marks remained on his body. Scars, marks, cuts. Exactly how he escaped, the teenager did not specify. He said he was afraid, that he had been threatened, and that he couldn't give names because it was dangerous for him and his family. The San Antonio police contacted the Barclay family and broke the news. Beverly picked up the phone and heard the words she had been waiting 3 years for. "Your son has been found. He is in Spain. He is alive." For 3 years, she had woken up with the thought that today, perhaps, something would change. For 3 years, she had looked at the door when she heard footsteps on the porch. And now he was found. Now someone had to fly to Spain to officially identify him and bring him home. And here a question arose that investigators and journalists would later dissect. Who exactly would fly? Beverly couldn't. She didn't have money for the ticket and was still in the process of rehab. Jason was also out for obvious reasons. That left Carrie, the eldest sister, the only one in the family who had a stable life and the opportunity to go abroad. It was she who flew to Spain to pick up the brother she hadn't seen in 3 years. And from this moment, the story that seemed like a miraculous rescue would begin to gradually fall apart. Carrie flew, and alone at that. Not the mother, who stayed in San Antonio, and not Jason, who didn't participate in the discussion at all. The sister bought a plane ticket, packed a bag with family photos, and flew to Spain to pick up the brother she hadn't seen in 3 years. At the shelter, she was met by staff, who immediately warned her. He is frightened, hardly speaks, and is afraid to leave the room. 3 years in the hands of kidnappers. Such a thing breaks the psyche, and she should be prepared for the fact that he has changed significantly, both externally and internally. Carrie nodded and said she was ready for anything. He was brought into the meeting room. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead and dark glasses. He sat hunched over, looking at the floor, and when she entered, he slowly raised his eyes. Carrie stopped at the door and looked at him. In front of her sat a young man, thin and angular, with dark hair. And when he finally took off his glasses, she saw his eyes. They were brown, but Nicholas's eyes were blue. He began to speak, and there was a noticeable accent in his voice, but not a Texan one, some kind of European one. He explained this by the fact that for 3 years, he had been forced to speak only French, so he had almost forgotten English and now had to remember it. Carrie sat next to him and took out photographs. The house where they grew up, their mother Jason, her son who was his nephew, neighbors, school. She showed photo after photo and asked, "Do you remember this? And this? And this place?" He answered slowly, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking for clarification. At one point he smirked and said, "Is Grandpa still such an asshole?" And this phrase, apparently, shifted something. Carrie looked at the person in front of her and saw that he was older than he should be, taller, with different facial features and a stranger's voice. But he knew about Grandpa, knew the names of family members, and knew the house address. She sat with him for over an hour, asked questions, listened to answers, and tried to understand what she was feeling. Then she stood up and went to the judge who was handling the case. And here is a moment that would later be analyzed again and again. Carrie said, "This is my brother. I am taking him home." She signed all the necessary documents and swore under oath that the person before her was Nicholas Patrick Barclay, a citizen of the United States. Based on her testimony, the American consulate issued him a new passport, and 2 days later, they boarded a plane together. She was taking him to Texas, to the mother who had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, to the brother who that night didn't want to pick him up from the basketball court, and to the house he left on June 13th and never returned to. She was bringing home her brother, or the one she decided to consider her brother. The man Carrie was taking to Texas was not actually named Nicholas Barclay. His real name was Frédéric Pierre Bourdin, and he was born in France, in the city of Nanterre, on June 13th, 1974, exactly 20 years before the day the real Nicholas disappeared. He never knew his father. His mother said it was a married Algerian named Cassie. But maybe that was true, and maybe not. She didn't really remember herself. Frédéric was raised by his grandmother and grandfather in Nanterre, and he grew up without warmth, without attention, and without the feeling that anyone needed him. At some point, he simply left home, reached Paris, and moved on from there. Shelters, streets, other people's houses, random people. By the time he reached adulthood, he had no profession, no documents, and no future of any kind. But he had something else, a skill he had honed practically to perfection. He knew how to become another person. The first time he passed himself off as a teenager, he was already an adult. He went to a shelter, called himself an orphan, and said he was 15. They believed him, gave him a bed, food, and care. He lived there for several weeks until he was exposed. And when he was, he simply left and did the same thing in another place. Then a third, then a fourth. By 97, a trail stretched behind him across Europe, France, Spain, Germany, Switzerland. Dozens of identities, dozens of names. An orphan from a conflict zone, a refugee, a victim of human trafficking. Each time, a new story, a new legend, and a new chance to get what he never had, namely, a family. The press would later call him the chameleon. And he truly was a chameleon, because he knew how to change his appearance, voice, age, and even nationality. The only thing that remained unchanged was the hunger for belonging, for a home, for people who would say, "You are ours." And so in October 97, he was sitting in a shelter in Linares, and his latest legend was beginning to come apart at the seams. The staff was asking more and more questions and demanding documents he didn't have. He needed to come up with something urgently. And then he did what would change the fates of several people at once. He called the National Center for Missing Children in the USA and introduced himself as an employee of the Spanish shelter. He described himself: short, thin, dark hair, gap between the front teeth. And he asked, "Is there anyone in the database who fits this description?" They gave him a name. Nicholas Barclay, San Antonio, disappeared in 94. When the fax with the missing person flyer arrived at the shelter, Bourdin realized he had a serious problem. The photograph showed a blonde boy with blue eyes, thin and short, 3 tattoos, the letter T on the hand between the thumb and index finger, a J on the shoulder, and more letters on the ankle. Bourdin looked in the mirror and saw a man with dark hair, brown eyes, and a French accent. Nothing in common with the boy in the photograph. Any normal person at this point would have stopped and thought of something else. No, Bourdin did not. He got some hydrogen peroxide and lightened his hair. Then he asked the guys at the shelter to give him tattoos exactly like the ones on the flyer, with a needle, without anesthesia, just from the photographs. A T between the thumb and index finger, a J on the shoulder, letters on the ankle. By morning, everything was ready. And now his body had the same markings as the missing American teenager. But one problem remained that couldn't be solved with peroxide or a needle: the eyes. Nicholas's were blue and Bourdin's were brown, and there was no way to dye those. So he invented a story. He would say that the kidnappers performed medical experiments on him, injected some drugs to change his appearance and make him unrecognizable. They chemically changed the color of his irises so he couldn't be identified. The story sounded completely insane, but Bourdin counted on the fact that no one would verify it. Who even knows if such a thing is possible or not? The accent also required an explanation, and one was found. For 3 years, he was supposedly forced to speak only French, so he almost forgot English, and his Texan drawl vanished completely. Now he speaks the way people speak in Europe, because that is where he was held all this time. Age was the hardest part. Nicholas, at that point, should have looked significantly younger, while Bourdin clearly looked like an adult, and the difference was striking. But if you added the story of torture, hunger, and constant stress, then this too could be explained. Trauma ages a person, and people who have survived such hell look completely different from their peers. And so, for every possible question, he had an answer. For every doubt, there was an explanation. And for every discrepancy, he prepared a story that was impossible to verify. After that, he called the San Antonio police and again introduced himself as a shelter employee. He said the boy they were looking for was here, that he had given his name, Nicholas Barclay, and that he wanted to return home. They handed the receiver to the mother. Bourdin spoke softly and uncertainly, exactly how a teenager who had spent 3 years in hell would speak. And she believed it, or decided to believe it. November 97. The plane landed in San Antonio, and Bourdin walked down the steps, squinting from the bright Texan sun. This was the first time in his life he had stepped on American soil, and he was doing it under someone else's name, with someone else's documents, and with someone else's story. Cameras were waiting for him at the airport. Local television had come to film the miracle. A boy who disappeared 3 years ago returned home from a real hell. Journalists with microphones, cameramen with cameras, camera flashes. It was exactly the kind of story people want to see on the evening news, and everyone was ready to film it. The family stood at the terminal exit. Beverly was in front of everyone, looking at the person walking toward her, trying to see her son in him. He was taller than she remembered, significantly older, and generally somehow different. But she stepped toward him and hugged him. Before the cameras, it looked like a full-fledged reunion. Hugs, tears, a sigh of relief. Journalists filmed every second because it was the perfect image for the evening broadcast. Carrie stood nearby and smiled. Her husband Brian stood slightly behind, and her nephew Cody, Carrie's son, looked at his uncle with curiosity. He was glad Nicholas was finally back. But Jason was not at the airport, and back then no one gave it much importance. Bourdin was taken to Carrie's because he would live with her in a trailer on the outskirts of the city. A small house, cramped rooms, and 2 children. He was given space in Cody's room, having to sleep on the floor, but that didn't matter. The main thing was that he was here. He was home, and he was now Nicholas. The first days passed in a kind of euphoria. Neighbors stopped by to say hello, relatives called, and everyone wanted to see the boy who had returned from nowhere. Bourdin kept quiet and hardly spoke, and when asked why, he explained it by trauma and said he needed time. No one objected or insisted on talking. Beverly came every day. She sat next to him, looked at him, sometimes cried, and sometimes was just silent. Bourdin didn't understand exactly what she saw when she looked at him. Her son, a stranger, or something else, namely, the opportunity to finally close a door that had stood open for 3 years? And here is what surprised him most of all. He was sure it would be difficult, that he would be exposed within a week, that someone would look closer, ask the right question, or demand some evidence. But no one asked questions. No one demanded evidence. They just accepted him, without DNA analysis, without checking fingerprints, without comparing old and new photographs. They just accepted him, and that was it. Bourdin lay at night in someone else's house, in a foreign country, under someone else's name, and thought of only one thing. Could it really be this simple? He was enrolled in school. Nicholas Barclay returned, traumatized, but alive, sat at a desk alongside teenagers. Teachers looked at him with sympathy, because the story of the kidnapping and return had already spread throughout the county. No one expected much from him. The main thing was that he was here, and trying to return to a normal life. His classmates looked at him differently. He was strange, too adult, and too quiet. He spoke with an accent that was unlike anything familiar and moved not like a teenager, but like a person who had long since outgrown school hallways and found himself in them by accident. At home, Bourdin studied the family. He looked at the photographs on the walls, memorized names, dates, and events. Cody told him about the real Nicholas, what he was like, what he liked, who he was friends with, and what he played. Bourdin listened and absorbed every detail, because the more he knew, the easier it was to play the role. Beverly continued to work. She arrived in the evening, had dinner with him, and left again. Conversations between them were short and superficial. She didn't ask him about his 3 years in captivity, and he didn't offer details. It was as if both were afraid to hear something they wouldn't be able to live with. Carrie behaved differently. She controlled practically his every step. When he didn't know something he should have known, she would prompt him. "Do you remember the Johnson neighbors? Remember how we went to Grandma's for Christmas? Remember the dog we had in the yard?" She literally filled his memory with recollections, one after another, like cards in a filing cabinet. And then, a month and a half after the return, Jason appeared. By that point, he had already gone through rehab and was working as a counselor at a drug treatment center. He came to Carey's to see the brother he hadn't seen in 3 years. Bourdin looked forward to this meeting most of all, and here is why. Jason was in the house on the very night Nicholas disappeared. Jason had spoken to him on the phone and refused to pick him up. Jason might know things the other family members didn't. They met in the trailer's living room. Jason looked at him for a long time and said nothing. He didn't hug him, didn't smile, didn't say, "Welcome back." He just stood and watched. Then he said only 2 words, "Good luck." After that, he turned and left. Bourdin remained standing in the middle of the room. In his life, he had seen many different reactions to his transformations. Joy, tears, suspicion, sometimes anger. No, he had never seen this. Jason didn't look at him like a brother. He didn't look at him at all like a person he had once known. And yet, he didn't say a word against it. He didn't ask a single question. He just left. And this reaction, or rather, its absence, would later become one of the main mysteries of this entire case. The question everyone would later ask sounds simple. How could they not see? Eyes of a different color, a voice with a clear European accent, the face of an adult man rather than a teenager. Height, build, manner of moving. Everything was different. Any outsider, looking at a photo of the real Nicholas next to this man, would immediately say they were 2 completely different people. But the family accepted him, and this requires an explanation. Psychologists who work with relatives of missing persons call this phenomenon acceptance out of despair. When a person lives for 3 years in complete uncertainty, without answers, without the ability to let go, their brain begins to work quite differently. Critical thinking gradually shuts down, and any alternative to the current state becomes acceptable, even if it contradicts obvious facts. Eye color changed? That means the kidnappers did something to him. Some experiments or injections. An accent appeared? That means he was forced to speak another language. Looks older and taller? Trauma changes people. Everyone knows that. And so for every discrepancy, an explanation was found because the alternative was simply unbearable. And there was only one alternative: to admit that her son was gone, that 3 years of waiting were in vain. And so it turns out that believing in the impossible is sometimes easier than accepting the obvious. Researchers had recorded similar cases before. Families accepted strangers, completely ignoring glaring discrepancies. And they did this not because they were stupid or inattentive. They saw everything, but truly seeing was too painful. So the brain simply refused to process that information. Beverly lived with an open wound for 3 years. Every day she thought about her son. Every night she asked herself what happened to him. When they told her he had been found, that wound finally began to heal. Admitting now that it wasn't him would mean tearing it all open again and returning to the exact same point she had been trying to escape for 3 years. Carrie flew to Spain, signed official documents, and swore under oath that this man was her brother. If she were to say now that it wasn't Nicholas, she would automatically be admitting that she had made a serious mistake. Or worse, that she knew the truth and brought him to America anyway. Jason remained silent. Maybe he saw the truth from the beginning. Maybe he only suspected it. But he didn't say a word. Not to the police, not to his mother, not to his sister. He simply left after that short meeting and never appeared again. And so, it turns out that each member of this family had their own reason not to ask questions. Or, if you look at it another way, each had their own reason for not wanting to hear the answers. The story hit the news and quickly spread across the country. A boy who disappeared 3 years ago returned from Europe, where he was held by an international human trafficking ring. A true miracle that people want to show in prime time and discuss on evening talk shows. Producers of the TV program Hard Copy called a private investigator named Charlie Parker and asked him to come for an interview with the family, to look, assess the situation, maybe find some new details for the story. Parker agreed because the story seemed interesting to him. He arrived at the house where the family lived. The film crew was setting up equipment and adjusting cameras, while Nicholas sat in a chair preparing for the interview. Parker settled off to the side and just watched. To his left sat Beverly and Carrie. To his right, on a shelf, stood a photograph of the real Nicholas, and directly in front of him was the man who called himself by that name. Parker watched and listened, and the longer he did so, the less he believed what he was seeing. The accent was not Texan, but clearly European, likely French. The manner of speaking betrayed an adult man, not a teenager. The face was different, and the eyes were brown, though in the photograph to the right, they were absolutely, certainly blue. At one point, Parker asked the cameraman to take a close-up and show this man's ears. The fact is that ears do not change with age, and Scotland Yard had long used this method for identification. Parker had read about it and knew that the shape of the auricle is unique, like a fingerprint. In the evening of the same day, he uploaded the filmed footage to his computer and opened Photoshop. He placed 2 images side by side, the ear of the real Nicholas from an old photograph and the ear of the man from today's interview. And here, everything became obvious. They didn't match, and not even close. The shape was different. The curve of the lobe was different. The position of the cartilage also differed. These were the ears of 2 completely different people. Parker called Beverly and told her straight, "This is not your son. I compared the photographs, and the ears don't match." She didn't believe him, and judging by everything, didn't even want to discuss the subject. Then he called the FBI. An agent named Nancy Fisher listened to him but was skeptical of the information. The family had officially recognized this person. The documents were in order, and the American consulate had issued him a passport. Who was Parker to argue with all that? Furthermore, the FBI warned him not to interfere in a possible federal investigation because it could be seen as obstruction of justice. Parker hung up the phone and looked again at the photographs on his computer screen. He knew exactly that he was right, and he was not going to stop there. And it was precisely his stubbornness that would ultimately trigger the chain of events leading to the exposure of this entire story. Parker began digging deeper, and this time not only into the imposter, but also into the Barclay family itself. He returned to the night Nicholas disappeared, to June 13th, 1994. Around 10 in the evening, the boy called home from the basketball court and asked to be picked up. Jason answered that their mother was sleeping after a night shift, so let him walk. Nicholas hung up and left the court heading home. 1.5 miles along a familiar road, and he didn't arrive. And here, Parker asked himself a question the police for some reason hadn't asked 3 years ago. What exactly was happening in the Barclay house that evening? He began talking to neighbors, and one of them remembered something important. On that night, screams, loud and angry, were coming from the Barclay house. One of the neighbors even called the police. A patrol arrived, but the call was cancelled with the standard phrasing: family quarrel, situation under control. A report was not filed. Parker looked at the timeline of events and saw a picture that troubled him. Nicholas calls home and asks to be picked up. Jason refuses. After some time, screams are heard from the house. The police arrive and leave with nothing. Meanwhile, Nicholas disappears somewhere halfway home. Too many coincidences for one evening. He began gathering information about Jason: an older brother, cocaine addiction, a history of breakdowns and aggressive behavior. Neighbors said he could be tough, very tough, especially when he was on substances. And here's another detail that caught Parker's attention. In September 1994, 3 months after Nicholas's disappearance, it was Jason who called the police. He said he saw his brother at night near the garage, that he was allegedly trying to climb inside and ran away when he was spotted. The police arrived, searched the entire neighborhood, but found nothing. They decided Jason was mistaken or had imagined it. But Parker knew something about such calls. In cases like this, relatives sometimes report false sightings of the victim to create the illusion that the missing person is still alive. This helps deflect suspicion from themselves and steer the investigation in a different direction. The picture that was gradually forming was very uncomfortable. A troubled teenager with run-ins with the police. An aggressive older brother with a serious drug addiction. An exhausted mother who worked at night and had long since stopped coping with the situation. A house where the police were called so regularly that patrol officers knew the address by heart. And a boy who called home, asked to be picked up from the court, and then disappeared forever. Parker didn't know exactly what happened that night in June 1994. But he understood one thing more and more clearly. The answer to the question about the fate of the real Nicholas Barclay should not be sought in Spain. The answer was here, in this house and in this family. And perhaps that is why they so easily accepted the imposter, because it was in their interest for Nicholas to be alive. Jason Barclay was 11 years older than Nicholas, and in '94 he was already an adult. Cocaine appeared in his life long before his brother's disappearance, and by that point, he had already gone through several cycles: relapses, withdrawals, short periods of clarity, and then relapses again. His mother asked him to return home to help handle Nicholas, and Jason agreed. Thus, there were two men in the house, a drug addict and a teenager who had long since become impossible to control. Neighbors later recalled that there were constant conflicts between the brothers. Nicholas wouldn't listen to anyone, and Jason tried to discipline him, and sometimes it went too far. Screams, slamming doors, and at times sounds that resembled blows. The police were called more than once, but each time it ended the same way. A family quarrel, the situation is under control, no report is filed. And so on that very night, June 13th, Jason was home. It was he who answered Nicholas's phone call. It was he who refused to pick him up from the basketball court. And he was the last person to speak to his brother before he disappeared. And then screams came from the house. The police arrived. And then there was silence. Parker talked to people who knew the family well, and the picture became increasingly grim. Jason could be very tough, and on substances, he became completely unpredictable. He lashed out at his mother, lashed out at his younger brother, and he was not always able to control himself. FBI investigators also took notice of Jason, but this happened later, after the imposter had already been exposed. Agent Nancy Fisher tried to talk to him, but he avoided meetings and refused to engage. When they finally managed to interrogate him, he behaved distantly and almost with indifference. He answered questions about his brother in monosyllables and expressed neither grief nor joy, nor even simple interest in what had happened. And that was when Fisher asked him directly, "Did you know the person in your house was not Nicholas?" Jason replied, "Yes, I knew." She asked, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He simply shrugged and replied, "I didn't care." This was not the answer of a man who had lost a brother and waited 3 years for his return. This was the answer of a man who knew for certain that his brother was never coming back. A man who, perhaps, knew exactly what had happened to him. Parker also met with Jason several times, asking questions and pressing him harder and harder. At one point, he told him straight to his face, "I know you are involved in Nicholas's disappearance." Jason just stared back at him in silence. He didn't deny it, didn't defend himself, and didn't get indignant. He just stared. A few weeks after that conversation, Jason was gone. And this moment would become another point in the case that would remain forever unanswered. February 1998. By this time, 5 months had passed since Nicholas returned to America. Parker had not given up and continued to pressure the FBI, demanding a full identity check of this person. Agent Nancy Fisher finally obtained a court order for compulsory fingerprinting and a DNA blood sample. Nicholas resisted, and the family was also against it. But you cannot go against a court order, and the procedure was carried out anyway. The fingerprints were sent to Interpol, and the reply came surprisingly quickly. Frédéric Pierre Bourdin, a French citizen, born in the city of Nanterre. He was on an international wanted list on charges of fraud and forgery. Known to the police of several European countries as a serial imposter, his nickname in the databases was the Chameleon, it was not Nicholas Barclay, and now it was officially proven. On March 6, 1998, Parker met with Bourdin in a roadside diner. They sat at a table and ordered pancakes. Parker looked at the man across from him and thought about how, for 5 months, this Frenchman had lived in someone else's family, slept in someone else's house, and carried someone else's name. And no one, not the mother, not the sister, not the police, had stopped him during all that time. At one point, Bourdin looked up from his plate and said, "She is not my mother, and you know that perfectly well." Parker remained silent and waited for more. And then Bourdin uttered what put an end to this part of the story. "My name is Frédéric Bourdin. I am French, and Interpol is looking for me." 2 hours after that conversation, FBI agents came for him. He was arrested right there in the diner. Handcuffs, a protocol, a car with flashing lights at the entrance. The performance that had lasted 5 months was finally over. But for the investigators, everything was just beginning. Because they now faced questions for which there were no simple answers. Bourdin was a fraudster. That much was clear and proven. But how could he live for 5 months with a family that should have recognized their own son? How did the mother not see that the person before her was a complete stranger with a different eye color and a European accent? How did the sister, who flew to Spain and swore under oath that this was her brother, not notice such obvious discrepancies? There were only 2 possible explanations. Either they were so blinded by grief and the desire to have Nicholas back that their brains simply refused to see reality, or they knew everything from the very beginning and kept silent because it was beneficial for them for Nicholas to be alive and returned home. After Bourdin's arrest, the FBI began to look at the Barclay family with completely different eyes. From that moment on, the investigation, which began as a fraud case, gradually turned into something much darker. During interrogations, Bourdin spoke willingly, but he talked less about himself and more about the Barclay family. He described in detail how everything had happened from the beginning, how Carrie flew to Spain, how she walked into the meeting room and looked at him. And this is what he told the investigators. He expected her to scream, call the police, or at least say that this was not her brother. But she didn't scream. She looked him in the eyes, and at that moment, he saw something he didn't expect. He saw that she knew that a complete stranger was sitting in front of her, knew that this was not Nicholas. And she still told the judge, "Yes, it's him. I'm taking him home." "She didn't believe me for a second," Bourdin told investigators. "But she decided that I would be her brother. It was her own decision, not mine." On the plane back to Texas, Carrie showed him family photos and told stories from the past. She named relatives, neighbors, friends. She asked again and again, "Remember this? And this? Do you remember this moment?" And she did it as if she were drumming the information into his head, layer by layer. She wasn't testing his memory. She was creating it. And here, Bourdin said a phrase that would later be quoted in all materials about this case. "They used me exactly the same way I used them." He was certain he understood why the family had accepted him. As long as Nicholas is alive, no one is looking for him. As long as Nicholas is at home, no one asks uncomfortable questions. No one digs in the yard. No one wonders exactly what happened that night in June 1994. They knew the real Nicholas was already gone. Bourdin said, during interrogations. One of them knew for sure. Maybe all of them did. When I appeared, it was a real gift for them, a chance to close the matter once and for all. A living Nicholas means only one thing. There is no one else to look for. Investigators listened to his testimony and wrote down every word. They simultaneously disbelieved him and believed him because the situation was too strange for simple explanations. Bourdin was a liar, a professional, serial, and perhaps pathological one. Everything he said could have been another manipulation or an attempt to shift the blame onto others. Revenge against the family that eventually abandoned him and turned him over to the police. But one thing truly bothered investigators, journalists, and everyone who later studied the case. Why did they accept him? Why did the mother hug a man with a completely different eye color at the airport? Why did the sister swear under oath in a Spanish court that this man was her brother? Why, during the 5 months he lived in their house, did no one demand a DNA test, or at least compare fingerprints? And the main question that remained unanswered: why, after Bourdin's exposure, did no member of the family ever ask, where then is the real Nicholas? The FBI shifted the focus of the investigation. Now the main question was not who is the imposter, but what happened to the real Nicholas Barclay. From that moment, investigators began to look at the family no longer as victims of fraud, but as potential suspects. Each family member was interrogated separately. Beverly was confused about the dates and details of that night. She didn't remember exactly what time she returned from work on June 13th. She didn't remember hearing screams from the house. She didn't remember seeing Jason when she arrived. To direct questions, she answered evasively and constantly looked away, avoiding eye contact with the investigators. She was connected to a polygraph, and the results were ambiguous. She passed the first test, passed the second one, but failed the third. This wasn't direct proof of anything, but it added questions to the overall picture. Carrie behaved quite differently during interrogations, aggressive and assertive. She accused the FBI of hounding the family and said they were victims who had been deceived by a professional fraudster. And instead of looking for their brother, federal agents were for some reason interrogating them instead. She categorically refused to discuss the night of Nicholas's disappearance and did not want to talk about Jason and his relationship with his younger brother. Jason himself avoided meeting with investigators as much as possible. When they finally managed to bring him in for questioning, he was apathetic, almost somber, and answered all questions in monosyllables. He admitted that he knew from the beginning that the person living in their house was not Nicholas. When asked why he had remained silent all that time, Jason simply shrugged and didn't answer. Agent Nancy Fisher later told journalists one thing that struck her the most. During the entire investigation, not a single family member ever asked us, "Where then is our son? Where is our brother? What actually happened to him?" They weren't looking for Nicholas. They didn't demand the search continue. They didn't beg to find the truth about what happened. They behaved as if they already knew there was no one to look for. Meanwhile, Parker continued to work parallel to the FBI. He talked to informants, dug into the family's past, and looked for people who might know or have seen something. At one point, one of his sources provided information that could overturn the entire case. It was possible that Nicholas's remains were in the yard of the house where the Barclays lived. the FBI requested permission to conduct excavations and exhumation. But for this, they required either the consent of the property owners or sufficiently strong grounds to obtain a search warrant. The family did not give consent, and at that time, the investigation did not have grounds that the court would consider sufficient. The investigation hit a wall again, and this wall was built from the silence of the very people who should have wanted to know the truth the most. April 1998. Only a month had passed since Bourdin's arrest, and then a turn occurred in the case that changed everything. Jason Barclay was gone. The official cause was a cocaine overdose, and it was recorded in the documents as an accident. He had only recently completed rehabilitation. He worked as a counselor at a drug treatment center, helping other people cope with the same addiction he had gone through. Colleagues later told investigators that he was clean and was doing well. It seemed that the worst was behind him, and he was finally climbing out of the hole he had spent so many years in. And then a relapse happened. One injection, and it was all over. For the investigation, this was a real catastrophe, because Jason was the main person who could shed light on the events of that night. He was in the house on June 13, 1994. He was the last person in the family to speak to Nicholas on the phone. He had refused to pick his brother up from the basketball court, and he might have known exactly what happened after that phone call. Jason was the only person who could tell the truth about that evening. And now he was silent forever. Parker learned of the incident by phone. He hung up and sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had happened. He had been so close to the solution, literally just a few steps away from the answer to the main question of the case. And now the key witness was gone, taking everything he knew with him. A coincidence? Perhaps so. Addicts relapse. It happens all the time, even after successful rehab. One bad day, one moment of weakness, one wrong decision, and the person is no more. It happens, and there is nothing unusual about it. But Parker did not believe in coincidences, especially in this case, where everything had been strange and wrong from the start. Jason had been interrogated several times in recent weeks. He was being pressured from all sides. The FBI was asking questions he clearly didn't want to answer. Parker himself had told him to his face that he knew of his involvement in his brother's disappearance. And a few weeks after all this pressure, Jason was gone. One of the investigators who worked on the case later told journalists, with his passing, the last real hope of learning the truth about what happened to Nicholas disappeared. Beverly had lost a second son. Now she had neither of them left. One disappeared under strange circumstances and was never found. The other died of an overdose, taking all the answers to the questions the investigation never managed to ask him. After Jason's death, the case gradually began to grow cold. The main suspect was unavailable. There was no direct evidence against the other family members, and without it, obtaining a warrant for a search or excavation was practically impossible. And so the investigation, which seemed so close to a resolution, reached a dead end again. The FBI did not give up because there was still one more way to get answers, namely, to find Nicholas's remains. Parker's informant pointed to the yard of the house where the Barclay family lived in 1994. Agents wanted to excavate, bring in equipment, remove the topsoil, and check if there was something underground. But for this, They needed either the consent of the owners or a court order. And to get an order, concrete evidence was needed. Witness testimony, clues, something material to rely on in court. The investigation had none of that. Only suspicions, only the words of a professional fraudster, and only the stubborn silence of a family that refused to answer questions. Agent Fisher met with Beverly and tried to explain the situation to her. She asked for voluntary consent to conduct excavations in the yard and said directly, "If there is nothing there, we will close this matter forever, and you can finally move on with your lives without being under suspicion." Beverly listened to her and refused. Then Fisher talked to Carey. The same request, the same arguments, the same hope for cooperation, and the same answer: a refusal. Neither the mother nor the sister agreed to allow investigators onto the property, and they did not explain the reasons for their decision. Without the family's consent and without sufficient grounds for a court order, it was legally impossible to conduct an excavation. The prosecutor's office studied all the collected materials and issued an official decision. The available evidence was insufficient to bring charges against any member of the Barclay family. The case was effectively closed. Bourdin was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, which was 3 times the standard sentence for such crimes. The judge took into account the moral suffering he caused to the family of the missing person, the suffering of a family that, perhaps, suffered for a completely different reason and from completely different memories. Nicholas Barclay was never found, alive or otherwise. His case remained in the official status of missing person, which formally meant he could be anywhere. Formally, hope for his return still flickered. But everyone who worked on the case perfectly understood the real state of affairs. There was no hope. The teenager who called home on the evening of June 13, 1994, and asked to be picked up from the basketball court never made it home. And he never would. And those who knew why it happened and exactly what occurred on that short stretch of road continued to remain silent. And that silence, by all appearances, they intended to keep until the end. Everything in this story aligns, not as legal proof, but as a logic that explains the behavior of every participant. And this is the picture that emerges if you look at everything that happened from this point of view. The family didn't accept Bourdin because they were deceived, not because grief clouded their minds and turned off their critical thinking, and not because they so desperately wanted to believe in a miracle. They accepted him because they needed to, because a living Nicholas solved a very specific problem for them. As long as Nicholas is alive, no one looks for him. As long as Nicholas is at home, no one asks uncomfortable questions. No one digs in the yard. No one wonders why screams were heard from the house that night. And no one asks exactly what Jason did after he hung up the phone. And now, look at the details that seemed strange before and now make sense. Carey flew to Spain alone, not the mother, but her. The first contact with the imposter, the first assessment of the situation, the first and main decision. She looked at a man with brown eyes, a French accent, and a completely alien face, and told the judge, "This is my brother." She signed official documents and swore under oath that she recognized him. Why did she do it? Perhaps because she knew one simple thing. The real Nicholas was never coming back. On the plane home, she wasn't testing this man's memory. She was creating it. She was putting memories into his head that he didn't have, and preparing him for the role he was to play for everyone else. Jason saw the imposter in the living room of the trailer and said only 2 words: "Good luck." He didn't hug him, didn't cry for joy, didn't scream that it wasn't his brother. He just wished him luck and left. This behavior also makes sense if you assume he knew. This person is not a threat. This person is a cover. Beverly hugged a complete stranger in front of television cameras at the airport. She did it because the cameras were filming and because that is exactly what a happy mother who has waited for her son's return should look like. The alternative, to tell the truth on camera, was simply impossible for her. Bourdin thought all this time that he was a predator who had found a vulnerable family and taken advantage of their grief. He was wrong. He found a family that was hiding something much more terrifying than common fraud, and they used him exactly the same way he used them. What exactly happened that night of June 13th? There is a version that cannot be proven in court, but explains absolutely everything. Jason, who was under the influence of substances. A breakdown that happened after the phone call. Harsh treatment that went too far and ended in tragedy. A mother who helped cover everything up. A sister who found out about it later and decided to keep silent. When the imposter from Spain appeared, they saw it as a chance to close the door forever and bury all the questions along with the answers to them. Bourdin served his 6 years, was released, and returned to Europe. There he married, had children, and, according to some reports, continued to impersonate other people because that was the only thing he truly knew how to do. The Barclay family was never convicted. There was not enough evidence, no remains, no confession. Nicholas was never found, not then, not later, and not to this day. The truth about what happened that night went with Jason. And so only one question remains that will hang over this story forever. What is more terrifying, a person who pretends to be your son, or a family that pretends to believe him?